Welcome back to the Vanessa G Fitcast. I'm Vanessa Pozos, and today with me is Omar Pozos, my co-host and husband. How are you doing today, Omar?
I'm doing good. I'm excited. We're doing a little traveling this weekend. The weather right now is a little dreary, but I'm excited because I feel like we've been home for a little while and I need a break. If that makes any sense.
It's been a while since we've traveled, actually. At least a while for us. We normally
like 3 months.
Travel quite a bit, and we haven't traveled really since, other than traveling for the hurricane in terms of like evacuation travel. We haven't really traveled since like September. So been a couple months, and I'm excited for that.
I know.
Today on this episode, I wanted to share something. So I actually had just shared a story on Instagram as well, which got me a little bit kind of thinking about this specific topic. And that's ultimately a topic of actually understanding what drives you, what motivates you, what does like your self-talk sound like? And so I'll reshare the story here for anybody who doesn't follow me on Instagram or didn't happen to catch this post. But I actually was reflecting on this recently because, you and I, we've been hanging out quite a bit with some of my family, my niece and nephew and baby niece, really getting some extra family time in lately around the holidays. And my niece, she's hilarious. She's 5 and she's at such a fun age. And it just kind of had me reflecting back on when I was 16 years old. I was babysitting a friend's 5-year-old, and like same thing. I think it's just that age, that 5-year-old age, especially for girls, is so fun because it's like they are like, you could have like actual conversation with them, but yet they're so just like innocent and childlike. And sometimes they'll say the most hilarious things.
I remember I was telling you, so our little niece, her name is Piper, but shout out to Pips and Elliot. But we were playing like hot potato, and every time like I would like purposely win, and I'd like
purposely win.
Yeah. Well, I'd be like, I would say like the "you're it" part, and she would have the ball, and she would get so upset. She'd be like, "Omar, like how could you?
Why do you always win hot potato?
Why do you always win hot potatoes? That's not fair." Then she just runs around and cries. But you're right. They're so innocent. They're so fun. Yeah.
Kind of back to my story. So when I was 16, I was babysitting this 5-year-old girl. And
I can't imagine 16-year-old Vanessa babysitting. Is that bad?
Well, I'm sorry. What are you implying here?
I don't know. I don't know. I think you would need a babysitter too. Listen, I'm 31.
I am going to remove you from the podcast. Again, back to my story. When I was 16, I was babysitting a 5-year-old girl. No more comments from you around that.
Listen, I'm keeping my mouth shut.
And so this, cute girl, she, it was time to have her take a shower and kind of get her ready for bed. And we were getting ready for the shower. Water was heating up, and she was standing there by the shower, and she was kind of looking at herself in the mirror, and she like had her hands on her cute little 5-year-old belly, and she just is staring at the mirror, and she goes, "I'm fat." And I, 16-year-old me, I'm just like frozen there for a minute of like, what do I even say to a 5-year-old saying I'm fat? And, of course, like at this age, like I was in high school, I was no stranger to maybe saying those things about myself or to myself at this time, or hearing other girls say those things. But I'd never heard someone so young say something like that. And honestly, I found it kind of shocking. I was honestly in my head just like, what do I say here? Why is a 5-year-old girl criticizing her body? And long story short, I was sharing this on Instagram and really talking a lot about how pervasive negative self-talk about our bodies is throughout our society, to the extent that like young girls even say these things. And they don't, just come up with these thoughts out of nowhere. They probably hear them from other places, and that's what causes them to start to take on these thoughts. And I do think that a lot of our generations and, current young generations growing up in this way, to where at young ages, we already were criticizing our bodies and talking to ourselves in our heads or out loud in this way. I think this is a lot of what keeps a lot of women stuck. And I want to kind of argue this, and I will argue this because having worked with a lot of women over the years, I have a lot of experience now to see what actually works long term when it comes to having success with our health and fitness goals. And what I believe actually works long term is going after your goals from a place of positive self-talk and from a place of true self-love, not from self-criticism, shame, hate, guilting yourself, or any type of those like critical thoughts. And now I do want to say, a lot of people might start on their journey. You might be here listening to this podcast because maybe you woke up and you were looking at yourself in the mirror and you were having some negative thoughts about your body, or you went to put on some, pants and they were a little bit tight and you were feeling uncomfortable and you start to criticize yourself and have some negative thoughts. Maybe you too sounded like that 5-year-old girl and you said, I'm fat. And that might have made you feel bad, might have made you feel a certain way about yourself, and led you to be here listening to this podcast thinking, I need to make a change. And that's okay. It is 100% okay and normal and absolutely fine to start your journey from that place of being pushed by pain, being pushed by those negative feelings and wanting to get away from the negative feelings and wanting to take action to change because we don't want to experience that feeling any further. However, we have to shift away from pushing ourselves from pain and shift consciously into a state of pulling ourselves forward via pleasure, via love, via just positive
self-care a little bit.
Yeah, self-care, and just ultimately these more positive and uplifting thoughts about ourselves and towards ourselves. And so ultimately that's kind of what this podcast is about. Is I want to talk a little bit here and bring some awareness to what maybe are the thoughts that you have about yourself. What is ultimately driving you to even be here listening to this podcast, listening to, things about health and fitness, and probably making some changes in your life around health and fitness. What's driving that? What's motivating that for you?
Yeah, I like that. And honestly, I know some of these things, at least for me as a guy, they're like, okay, like woo woo, like, I'm just going to suck it up and do it. But I will say this, from my own experience, to your point, Vanessa, I think a lot of what I've done in the past has very much come from that place of like, I don't want to feel this way, or like even, from my perspective, like growing up as a kid, like my family, like I come from a single mom, and there was a lot of just domestic issues at home, not a whole lot of money. And a lot of what I do now is because I'm like, you know what, I don't want to be like I was when I was a kid, or it does very much come from that place of pain. But then there comes to a point where I'm like, is that serving me anymore? Like I can't, especially when it comes to like body image stuff, I'm like, I can't call myself excuse my language, like a fat ass, or, be like, oh my gosh, you're so terrible, because that's only going to self-sabotage myself and keep me down this rabbit hole that I've been stuck in. Right. And so to your point, it's very important. I do think that, coming at it and looking at it from a different perspective and saying like, you know what, I'm doing this because of, I don't know, my kids, or I'm doing this because I want to feel a certain way. And instead changing that dynamic, that does help tremendously, because otherwise at a certain point, like, you're just talking down to yourself. You're like, and we use this example a lot, but I'm like, if this was your best friend sharing these things, like you probably wouldn't be like, yeah, you're right, you are a fat ass, or you are this, or you are that, right? To changing that dynamic, that to me, it does help you keep going. It does serve you more in the long run. To
be more of the positive self-talk, you're saying.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Not the other way around.
Well, let's, like you were saying there, like you were exactly correct. I think a lot of people will be like, this type of, mindset work is kind of woo woo. Like maybe even though like, yeah, I hear you, but like, I don't know if I really believe that to be true. It works for me to like push myself, from more of like that kind of criticism type of, point of view. But let's put some logic behind this here. So if you are talking to yourself in a way that is critical, in a way that is more of like you need to change. Like, why are you like this? Like, you look like that. You look terrible. Like those kinds of thoughts, right? Mm-hmm. Those kinds of self-criticizing type of dialogue, right? If you were telling yourself that, imagine if you were turning around to, like you were giving an example of talking to your friend, but let's say that like you turned around to a little girl in your life, like we were talking about Piper. Yeah. What if you said those same things to her? It doesn't have to be about even her body. What if it's about, let's say she's trying in school.
She's and trying to play hot potato with me. I'm like, you're terrible at this.
You're terrible at hot potato. No, if like, let's apply, school to it. Let's say that she's having a little bit of a hard time in school. And what if you turn to her and you're like, you've got to do better. You're not good at this. Like, why are you always, failing at this? Why are you always behind your classmates? How do you think that type of dialogue is going to make her feel? It's probably going to make her feel pretty bad about herself. It's probably going to make her feel, upset, sad, frustrated. It's probably going to have her lose confidence and belief in herself. And so guess what? Even though maybe your intention as a person, if you were to actually say something like that to a child, would be from like hopefully a good place of like you want them to do better, even though I think we can all agree here that that would not be the best route to go about that. But you doing that, you're not going to actually get the result that you want out of it. You're not going to cause her to then be like, you're right, I'm going to go and work hard at these things. And I think it's easy for us to understand that when we're thinking about talking about a child. But the reality is we all have a little bit of that inner child still in us who, is holding on to that kind of dialogue that has probably just been circulating in our own head from ourselves over years, over decades for many people, where you might be, a woman in your perimenopausal years who have just had this like loop running in your brain for years and years, just criticizing your body and yourself more often than not. And ultimately, that probably is, like you were saying, it is going to lead to the self-sabotage. It is going to cause you maybe to get started to where you're like, you're telling yourself like, yes, I got to change. This is terrible. I don't like feeling this way. But as you get going, you still feel bad. And it's hard to do good things for yourself when you feel bad. Another way we can look at this with logic is the fact that, okay, maybe that does get you going. Maybe that does motivate you. It gets you started to use that type of self-talk, that type of dialogue. But now as we continue on, you're going to experience less and less in that as you get results anyway. If your way of motivating yourself and pushing yourself is, you're fat and you're telling yourself that, then what happens when you do start losing weight and you no longer like feel like maybe you can actually tell yourself that anymore because it's no longer true? Well, now you lose motivation. Now you self-sabotage and you end up right back where you started again to ultimately kind of fulfill that need for, well, in order to continue to do the actions that keep me healthy, I need to be like criticizing myself in that way. So regardless, at some point you have to shift to that point of pulling yourself forward towards your goals from a positive and supportive internal dialogue place.
Yeah, I agree. There was an example that you and I read or saw or heard somewhere. It's like a rocket ship, right? Where like you can use pain as like a thruster to like get you going, get you forward. But then there comes a certain point where like that rocket hits, I don't know, a certain level. I'm not
like when it like exceeds like
right,
gravity
when it hits
or something.
like when it hits that outer level of like Earth, and then all of a sudden it's not that big thruster anymore. It's just more or less like gravity. It's that pull of gravity that it uses to get it to where it wants to go. That's the excess of my aerodynamics knowledge.
Someone who actually knows about those things is like, oh, you guys got that so wrong.
But that's my point is, again, I think it'll help you in the short term, but long term, if we want to actually do this sustainably and do this as a long-term goal, you have to use another level or another way of motivating yourself, another way to speak to yourself so that you don't get stuck in the cycle.
Yeah. And so, I mean, if you're, obviously you're listening to this episode, hopefully you're kind of getting to the point where you're like, all right, I can see that like this is something I probably need to work on. I probably do need to work on actively, consciously choosing more supportive thoughts towards myself, towards my body, towards what I'm doing, and kind of be more loving towards myself. I can logically start to see that now. However, we can still kind of feel stuck in the sense of like, well, I still also have those other more critical thoughts. Like those thoughts still pop up. How do I just like magically flip this switch to now being loving and supportive, right? Well, it's not as simple as just flipping a switch. In some ways it can be, but it does take work. It does take effort. And this is a lot of what we do in more of the mindset side of our coaching. And so I want to give our listeners kind of like an active, activity that you can actually take away from this episode to start working on these things. And this is one of the kind of many types of activities and just ways that we go about working on mindset with our clients. So one thing that we like to do with our clients to help them move away from these critical thoughts and like pushing themselves with pain and move towards pulling themselves with pleasure and using ultimately more of the kind of loving and supportive voice in their head. Well, we need to practice initially actually forgiving ourselves for things we've done in the past and actually officially kind of choosing more of this supportive role for ourselves. So we'll do an activity with clients where we actually have them write a letter to their past selves. So some of this can be some of that kind of inner child work as well. Write a letter to your past self apologizing for all of the mean, hurtful things that maybe you've said or you've even done to yourself and your body, and actually just taking ownership and apologizing for it. Truly writing that out. Writing is important because we write at a much slower pace than we can think or even that we can talk. And so it forces us to really be conscious of every single word and be very just intentional with choosing our words and really feeling the feelings in that process. That's why we write these letters out. And then after you write the letter kind of apologizing to yourself, then you write a letter back to yourself forgiving yourself. So you're kind of hitting it from both ends of the spectrum, where you are taking ownership and you are apologizing and you're owning the things that maybe you've done that have been more critical. And then you're going from the perspective of, actually, I forgive you. I forgive you, and we're moving on from this. And we're talking about then the things that we're going to do differently going forward. And we're kind of committing to going forward. I am going to be that loving, supportive person to myself that I need. So if that's something where maybe that interests you, I really do challenge you, take some space, take some time to do it. It doesn't have to take a long time. You could even do this on your phone, type it out, put it in the notes. You don't have to share it with anybody, but I really do challenge you. Even if you're someone where you're like, it doesn't really sound like that's for me, then it probably is definitely for you, because the less it feels like it's for you, the more you probably need it. So I would encourage you to give that a try. And if you find that interesting in terms of this type of more like identity change type of work and this like deeper mindset type of work, this is a lot of what we do in our one-on-one coaching as well. Really taking an individualized approach to understanding our clients, not just what's going on with their body, on that more of like hormonal health level and what's going on in labs and things like that, but truly seeing you as an individual and helping you understand what you need to do to change and truly step into that version of yourself that you're meant to be. So if that's something that sounds interesting to you, you can always apply for coaching via the link on my Instagram bio. That's at Vanessa G Fitness. Give me a follow there while you're at it. And then make sure that you subscribe to our podcast so that you never miss another episode. Thanks so much for listening, guys. We'll be back next week.
Bye, everybody.